work towards an assessment model. Therefore, we need to think about principles. And the first principle is simply to ask, and I'll go into more detail on this in the coming tutorials, but what is being assessed? And this is a really important question, folks, because if we don't ask this question, then we are going to struggle. So a couple of things. I am going to make a statement to you here. Now, you don't have to agree with this, but this is my opinion, and I think this is a really robust, reasonable finding. And that is that PE assessments, okay, that are the ones that you do, I do, ultimately that our students do, PE assessments, with the exception of final exams, are, and here's the key word, temporal. Now, if you're not sure exactly what I mean by that word, that means that they assess a moment. They are ultimately a measure of time. And let me clarify what I mean by that. They assess a moment rather than a person, rather than a student. Now, this is really important sort of philosophical point in my opinion. When we are talking about assessment models, we should be realizing that what we are assessing is a moment in time. I'm break into song if I'm not careful. And we are assessing that moment. We are taking a snapshot data point of that moment. We are not saying of this person, the student is an A grade, a 9 grade. No, we are assessing that moment. Therefore, folks, and this again goes towards opinion, but it's very well founded in research. Therefore, assessment results, what do they indicate? Assessment results, so we know whether students do well or badly in assessments, what do they equal? And I'm going to say, folks, if we use the word ability, then we have to put a line through there and say they do not equal ability. What assessment results do equal is performance. And I'll express that a bit more when we get into the data types in a few moments' time. So we are talking about that. And finally, folks, I'm going to stress that these ideas, I meant to choose a different colour really than that, these ideas, another yellow with green, these ideas relate to both knowledge and skills. So whether we think we are measuring a student's, which is obviously not what we're thinking about here, a student's knowledge or their writing skill, their command word, exam technique, interpretation, for example, we are not. We are ultimately measuring performance on knowledge and skills, and that's what I'm going to argue that we should be thinking about. Now, with that in mind, let me introduce you to a wonderful term in a beautiful presentation here. We are talking about formative assessments. What the hell are they, James? I'm sure you've come across this concept before, but they are, folks, ongoing assessments. Ongoing assessments. So these are activities and tests and quizzes that we do lesson by lesson that can be ongoing assessments, okay? Why do they matter? They matter because they build a comprehensive picture. And I'm going to come back to this point in a second. A comprehensive picture of what? Of performance. They also provide, folks, a continuous feedback loop. So if, for example, we are doing learning activities that derive, for example, data, let's call it quizzing as an example of that, that is going to give us a continuous feedback loop with our students. As a result of that concept, folks, we can also argue, for example, that we've got things that go from the informal to the more formal. It is both types of experiences that we can use as formative assessments. But make no bones about it, folks, the aim of formative assessment is learning. Okay, now that learning may come as a result of errors plus our feedback, but that is still learning. But formative assessment is what we are doing lesson by lesson by lesson by lesson, ongoing assessment that is data-centric, that produces a picture of what? Of performance and where our students are. And it's a great, and by the way, we're going to do whole tutorials on this. It's a great question to ask. Is that actually happening in our assessment model in our own course? Now, kind of at the opposite end of that, certainly not the opposite, but the opposite end of that consideration is we've got summative assessments. What do we mean by these? I guess we mean by these some kind of end of unitness. So they're kind of end of unit. They are often formal, or they certainly go towards being more formal. They are generally, they are weighted in terms of the experience, by the way, they are weighted towards grading. Don't have to be, by the way, But in general picture terms, people tend to do more grading of those things as a result. So this is kind of like this more end of unit, hopefully spaced, often interleave kind of end of unit exams, even a mock exam. This is kind of a summative assessment. It's quite formal. It's done in a proper formal test environment, and it's weighted towards grading. I think that one of the things we really need to call these things is these are data extraction points. Okay, we are taking the temperature. We are taking the temperature. And in fact, I'm going to put the word strategic in here because that's what they should be. Strategic data extraction points. We are taking the temperature of where the students are in this very moment. Now, another point we want to sort of consider here is therefore, what is assessment for learning? I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you here, but assessment for learning, I'll get into more detail in this in future tutorials, so I'm going to bastardize this slightly. If we take formative and we add summative and we combine them together in a beautiful assessment model, what should come out here is assessment for learning. Okay, that's what we should get. And the main aim of assessment for learning is the following. And if you want more detail on this, guys, I've got a whole playlist on this in the academy on this. It's metacognition should be the outcome. Now, if you're not familiar with metacognition, it could be considered kind of self-teaching and self-awareness. More importantly, it's the awareness of students have of their own strategies for learning and whether they're effective or not. A student who understands what works for them and what doesn't work for them is much more capable of learning, and as a result of that, metacognition is actually the proposed outcome of assessment for learning model, which is made up of formative and summative assessment types. Again, more of which in due course. These are just introductory terms. Finally, before we get onto data types, guys, I just want to mention to you the concept of self and peer assessment, which are really important. There's a couple of reasons why, if we do lots of assessment, we do need to use self and peer assessment both practically and also in terms of learning. First of all, it's a very empowering experience for students. If they are responsible for their own and others' feedback and performance, then that really helps. It also helps students identify gaps in one's own performance. Obviously, that is the case with self-assessment, as it can be with peer assessment. But when you're assessing yourself, of course, you become much more aware of how you're doing. They are a strong zone of feedback, and especially responding and actioning feedback. And finally, folks, they work, especially peer and self-assessment works really well in formative stages. So if you have got formative assessment built in, formative types of assessment, you are going to find peer and self-assessment really, really useful, and we'll do more work on that in the future. Now, with that in mind, folks, I want to get into data and assessment types. And I realise I'm throwing a lot of material at you on the board. In fact, I'm just going to expand it slightly all in one go here. So I'm going to make this slightly bigger. This is what we consider the tiers of assessment data. Now, if you look at different researchers' work, Tony Davis is a really good example. You'll see this called slightly different things. He refers to it as the data springboard. So I want to just give a nod towards his work, which I've experienced personally. It's absolutely brilliant. But this is what we're saying. Data comes in at least 4, and of course you could put sub-tiers if you want to do 4 tiers or layers. The first tier is a very, 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 very volatile, changeable, can be different 1 second to the next type of data. It is what teachers see, hear and feel. I'm going to write that in here. It's what teachers see, hear and feel. Notice, are the students focused? Are they on time? Are they there? Are they engaging with the learning? Are they completing homeworks? Are they on task? All of these things. You can implicate change in moments like that as a teacher. Now, of course, these things are going to predict. They're going to predict for Tier 2 data. Tier 2 data, hard to say, is also very volatile. It's quiz scores. It's task scores like worksheets. It's practice time. It's taking a tutorial on the everlearn.com and having the completion of that tutorial. Of course, if you're unfocused, this is going to be worse. If you're very focused, this is going to be better, right? Now, that Tier 2 data, that predicts for Tier 3. Tier 3 could really be called timely assessment as a whole. It's still volatile, but we're now getting to slightly more fixed points. It's timely assessments like a test. It's checkpoint scores and end-of-unit test scores. You see how these are kind of slightly more fixed points than where we started. And of course, folks, these predict for what? These predict for stable Tier 4 data. Mock exam grades. We can almost call this post-game. Now, that's not to say it's not useful or usable data, but the things that cause this to be good or bad happened down here. So I want to show that green arrow, because that green arrow represents controllability. The controllability, folks, is down here and to an extent here. But this is controllable. This is much less. Once that happens, we're sort of in trouble or on the right track, okay? So the point I want to get here is that as a teacher, we need to make more awareness of these data types, because those data types, if we're aware of the way that they can influence learning up that sort of pyramid, the better we are to intervene. Notice how powerful intervention is here, because this ultimately predicts for this, okay? So we want to be intervening here and here if we don't see what we want, obviously here as well, but this is way too late in the game. Think of yourself as a sports coach or team manager. Do you want to act on in-game data or post-game data? Because this, folks, is either post-game or very damn near it. This earlier stuff is more volatile and actionable, and that's what I want to get across.